Hi everyone, I'm Caroline Chappell. I'm a research director at Analysys Mason, responsible for what we call our cloud and platform services practice, where we look at all things cloud and how they relate to the telecoms industry. I'd like to introduce my great panelists today, Thomas von Brünn from Deutsche Telekom, Bastian Bianchi from Orange, and Partha Seetala from Rakuten Symphony. Gentlemen, I'd like to start by each of you introducing yourselves. Now, Thomas has set us a challenge of being a very lively panel, of trying to be the liveliest panel of the show. So you will be the judge, of course, as the audience. But I'm afraid I'm going to have to do this one sequentially, Thomas, and start with you if you'd like to introduce yourself, and then Bastian and Partha.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I have the pleasure to be with DT and serve the Organization for Technical Architecture and Strategy.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Bastian Bianchi. I'm in charge of the core network transport, and more recently, as I told you, in charge of the data center for Orange Belgium.
And I'm Partha Seetala, and until recently, I was the founder and CEO of a company called Robin.io based out of Silicon Valley. But some of you might have heard we were acquired by Rakuten Symphony, and right now I'm the president of the cloud business unit there.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And of course, it's lovely to be here in person, to be able to sort of talk in person as opposed to virtually with all the challenges that there have been with trying to sort of have a good discussion on Zoom, although we've all got a lot better at it, I think. But interesting, Bastian, that you mentioned the data center, because we've just done a big piece of research, and I was discussing it with Bastian before the panel, just to let you, Thomas and Partha, into it. And according to the research, there is a big disconnect in operators currently in terms of them managing their data centers, the way they manage their data centers, and how important those data centers are going to be to 5G, edge, and all the sort of future things that operators are hoping to do with their networks. So, of course, this does have implications for cloud native because, those data centers are where the cloud is going to run. So maybe you'd like to sort of, we should start there and just talk about, what are your plans for cloud? How cloud native are you? Is it really too early to start talking about, cloud native operations, given that some of the fundamentals may not even be in place yet?
Depending to whom you put the question, I think that for this part of the panel, it's maybe more mature than for at least for Orange. But indeed, we had at least we started the virtualization journey, so it was quite a painful journey, I would say. But we learned a lot from this, and we are on our way to cloud native, but still quite a lot of steps still to achieve.
But what do you mean, Bastian, by on your way to cloud native? What have you done so far?
So far, we as I was saying, a couple of years ago, we started with the virtualization. So we did the virtualization of a section of our network. Since we are part of a company, a large company, Orange, we implemented the Orange IaaS, so the solution that was prescribed by the group. And we learned a lot from this. I would say mainly from a technical perspective and from skills perspective. So we had the chance to reskill the people, and even if we will be discussing about the lessons learned we took from this experience, I think that the key thing was definitely to start experimenting the things on the real case, and trigger the change of the skills to have the opportunity to bring newcomers, new skilled guys, and to have this one roof organization where the legacy engineers were able to learn from the new engineer, and we discovered so much things that maybe we'll be discussing afterwards. But, and we are currently deploying our core 5G core. So that's where we are on our journey toward cloud native, and container on bare metal is the next step. in terms of architecture, we actually see that it's much more simple. So we expect that, and from a cost perspective as well, it's much efficient. So we expect a lot from this next generation.
Yeah, maybe I can take that and kick the ball a little bit further. I'm a big fan of being more concrete in terms of business outcomes, and also what do we mean if you use a big term like cloud nativeness. Yeah, and it has a number of angles that we should tackle. Of course, from the workload side. I mean, we could have a whole panel conversation on that topic. Yeah, when is a workload actually cloud native? And we love to challenge our vendors with that. If they say we are cloud native, say that's great. Here are our requirements. Go to the lab, show that you actually are. But you were asking on the operation model. And I can say that we have areas where we, I would say, really are cloud native and also reaping some benefits of that. And we are trying now to replicate that and make it easy to adopt it. And let me just show you a couple of angles as far as this is concerned. So we're asking our DevOps teams, for example, do you offer a service that is easily consumable within the organization? In the best case, without any human interaction, API-based, in self-service, for test automation, for CI/CD. What are the practices that you apply? Do you actually do in-service upgrades of your software? How long does it take you to bring a new software release into operation? Is it 2 days? Is it 5 days? How many outages do you have? Can you do canary testing? Something like that. So we monitor that. We've come up also with something like a maturity model from a couple of angles that help also the DevOps teams to get a useful input on where should they work on next on their journey to really become cloud native, so that they see where are we in this kind of benchmarking. And I like that a lot because that is really focusing on what do you change and what's the business outcome of that.
And that's interesting, but does that apply to one? How many functions does that apply to? What sort of percentage of your organization, I guess, is operating in that kind of model?
We are applying that to all our DevOps teams in the core environment. So that's a number of teams. But of course, the degree, I'd say like 200, something like that, teams. But the degree of maturity in a maturity model is very different depending on where you are. But helping them go through their journey, learning from the ones that are more advanced, providing platforms that people can build on so that they don't have to go through the learning journey yet again is something that really keeps us busy.
Yeah. And interestingly, because, I mean, we're talking here about Orange, we're talking about Deutsche Telekom, which, of course, are brownfield and have to go through that transition. And then we're going to field the ball to you, Partha, which, of course, you know, you had a greenfield. So everybody thinks you had it easy.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I can bring two different perspectives to this, right? One is, of course, as a vendor supplying to Rakuten Mobile. And then what I've seen, of course, first as a vendor to Rakuten Mobile, and now as somebody who's part of Rakuten Mobile or Rakuten Symphony. So first thing, right, clearly everybody knows, or most of you know that Rakuten Mobile was built as a cloud-native network from the get-go. And obviously that has a certain set of benefits, and it also simplifies how you think about rolling out your network. And clearly, that is the model that was thought out even before we got there, and that was a model that was deemed to be the one that is the most efficient in terms of the cost that you would be saving, as well as the agility with which you would be able to roll out newer services. So that's that from a Rakuten perspective. But even if I look outside of it, while we were an independent company, when we were talking to other vendors in the ecosystem, whether it is operators or vendors supplying to those operators, it was actually overwhelming to see how many of these vendors are packaging their applications or network functions as cloud-native functions. So it essentially is a leading indicator that there is something here that dramatically improves the operational model for operators once you embrace it. Of course, there's a leap of faith you have to make in terms of understanding that maybe there is a significant gain I'll get if we go down that path. But the fact that the vendors are moving down that path is actually a very strong indicator. So from my perspective, I think it is going to be, I mean, it is already here if you ask me, because as I said, not just Rakuten Mobile, but the other vendors, other operators that you're talking to, all the conversations are centered around how do you bring this cloud native thing to their brownfield deployment. Start maybe with a sliver, one small use case, and then expand from there.
I think that's an important point, though, because you're talking about, yeah, we're on this journey. We've got 5G, we've got Edge, we've even got a lot of sort of cloud native now coming into the transport network, particularly sort of layer 3 to 7. So we're on a kind of unstoppable journey. The question I have is, you know, how fast can we get there? And because it's not easy, but everybody's on this journey. Is it important that we get there quickly, or should we just say, like some operators are, you know what, we can just hand this to the hyperscalers because they know how to do it? How important is it that you know how to do it, and what's the best way to accelerate the journey?
I would say that first of all, you have to face a couple of reality things. I mean, on the brownfield aspect, that I mean, the telco sector has been growing quite low. I mean, over the last decades, which turned into we try to optimize the things on silos. So we had these RAN sharing agreements. So we have a very disaggregated operating model, and that's one of the most challenging. I mean, I'm repeating things that's already been said during the different panel, but I think it's one of the biggest challenge that we are facing, that we have tried to optimize so much the silos that want to get the end-to-end done. You are facing different partners. You have the if I take, for instance, the case of French Belgium, we have a RAN sharing agreement, which is quite new, so we have not yet implemented the full processes, the tools, and so on. We're still in the implementation phase, but on the legacy world. So just to make it work on the legacy, let's say, then we have the managed services provider for the transport, which is, not to name it, Ericsson. They have their own inventories tool that one day, if we like to take it to re-internalize it, we'll have the challenge to get our data back, and all the AI they implemented, these kind of things, we have to rebuild it. Then we have the corporates running our core network. You see, so you have so many, we have other partners for the B2B. So if you take all these bricks and you start asking yourself how to change the operating model, how to change the tools, how to become aggregated again, how to manage the end-to-end, I mean, you're turning into very, very complicated questions and this kind of, so I don't know how it is for in your case, but in ours, it's one of the biggest.
We're taking a big bet of that, on that, because we really want to differentiate to offer meaningful services to our customers, where we see that we can monitor and influence the way that our services are delivered. And in order to be able to do that, we have to have the capability to integrate the components, because otherwise we will be pushed down in the value creation and someone else will learn how to integrate these things. And that's the kind of space that I will not want to leave to the hyperscalers. We really want to be the ones that are managing what our customers experience and how to best evolve that. On the other hand, I really like to work with a number of partners because we can gain from that. I mean, competition is very normal. Be that in monetizing, I mean, we have the networking assets, and hyperscalers have access to developer communities, and I'm not sure that we can leverage the innovation potential on ourselves. So let's get together there, no problem as far as this is concerned. Also, you were starting the conversation with a data center, right? So data center infrastructure. I don't want to be in the business of engineering a cloud infrastructure. There are people that can do that better. Yet I haven't seen very convincing operational deployments. Rakuten may be one of a few exceptions where really you have a decent collaboration as far as this is concerned. So I'm very happy to partner in this environment also with other players, and we are in a lot of talks. But we have also learned what it really requires to have a telco workload running in a cloudified fashion, where you don't have a lot of overhead, where you really can control the life cycle. And that's a very different piece. It's pets, not kettles, right? And we have to learn that in the industry.
Yeah, to your question, right? Should the operators build the expertise, or do you just leave it to the hyperscalers? I would say that it's somewhat of a mixed answer, right? Obviously, I'm biased in the sense that we supply a cloud-native platform and all that. But if you put my bias aside, what is the fundamental difference between this new cloud-native model with what came before it? Right? What came before it, in terms of a software model, is a virtualization-driven model, right? Which is mostly based on likes of OpenStack and VMware and so on, right? And the reason why people perceive that to be very complicated, with all the virtues of virtualization, it's still complicated, is because from an underlying platform perspective, it was not an opinionated enough platform. So every vendor who was supplying their software network functions had their own way of doing things. They had their own way of deploying, own way of upgrading, lifecycle management, and so on. The fundamental difference with cloud native is that it is a very opinionated stack. Whether we like that opinion or not, it is an opinionated stack, right? That is a big difference. And because of that, every vendor is now forced to essentially build their deployment model of their network functions, how they upgrade it, how they scale it, how they do service assurance in a certain way. Is everyone doing it in the disciplined manner? Not yet, but we are going to get there, right? Now, as a result of this, I think the power now shifts back from, I would say, somebody else managing it, whether it's SIs or hyperscalers, back into the operators who can now, take a consistent deployment model and build expertise around that, because the cost of doing that is not as high as it was in the prior models. So to me, I think it's critical that operators, again, now if I put my Rakuten hat on, I would say that it's critical that operators build that expertise, because you don't want to yield the control point to somebody else, because that is where you're going to essentially, if you optimize on the control point, you'll be able to leverage it and then derive the cost benefits, the agility benefits, and so on. So,
I mean, that is interesting, because when we've benchmarked vendors, it's very interesting. We did a big word cloud of all the all the sort of Kubernetes or CNCF plugins and projects that they were using, and there's a remarkable lot of it's a remarkably opinionated stack, as you say. Everybody's kind of consolidating around the same sets of projects and plugins, and obviously based on Kubernetes, But when it comes to building the operations, the automation of that, which you were talking about, Partha, and you were talking about differentiation, should that be something that is differentiated, that you each have your own cloud-native operating model on top of that, or is there virtue in building a sort of common, like the Linux Foundation Nefio initiative, for example, some kind of common automation, or where does the differentiation start and stop? Because I think you were saying, Thomas, that there's some that you're happy to leave to others, and some that you would want to use yourself.
Yeah, but that's on differentiation and monetizing the services. But I mean, it was a very suggestive question. I think we can visit this at these panels. I mean, we all use the same buzzwords, but we are so unspecific if it comes to the terms on what specifically do we mean, and why can't we put the same requirements to our vendors? Because I have no interest to pay for integration every single time. I'm very happy to reuse that. And yet, we see that. That's also why some of those conversations sound very similar, even though you start from a different angle, because we are not very clear on what are our requirements in onboarding a workload. What does it mean if we say that we want to have test as code available? What are the standards that we set there and that we expect in the industry? And getting our act together as far as this is concerned is something that we can benefit from greatly. And there is nothing to be gained by differentiating on that angle.
I agree. I agree with your, and we try to trigger, to initiate this kind of, let's say, gathering. We have the eGet project, as you know. So indeed, that's something about, because when you mentioned the virtualization journey and the lack of maturity, indeed, that was, you have to reinvent it, to rediscover everything on your own. You have to discover, when you're part of a corporate, then you can learn from the experiment of the other. That's one thing, but it's interesting in terms of learning things, but if you take that from a cost perspective, it's definitely not profitable to go through this kind of. So indeed, we have to try at least to get the industry into the same direction, and we create a momentum in terms of standardization, in terms of practice, in terms of tools. That's definitely something we have to foresee.
Yeah. From a grand vision perspective, right, the whole idea behind this movement is to democratize everything, make everything uniform and all that, right? But in reality, I think we are far away from that right now. I think if you ask about differentiation, clearly, the cloud-native model is a model that influences how applications are built. And as a result of that, my prediction is that there will be less differentiation on how you do operations, right, once these applications are deployed. Mostly the differentiation is going to come in terms of how you consume it and how you create value-added services on top of it. In fact, if we get this right as an industry, I think if you ask me, it should be that you don't differentiate on the operations, and that becomes a standard, right? Maybe I'm too much of a purist here, but I think that becomes a standard, and then you start to build differentiation on your services you build on top, right? Purely as a technologist, I would say that the whole cloud-native model is actually geared towards delivering on that promise. Because again, I'll just go back to the previous example. Virtualization never really forced how an application needs to be built. Cloud-native actually forces how you think about building an application. In fact, it basically says things like, when you're building an application, you don't, as an application vendor, you don't have to worry about how you scale it. As long as you build it towards a specification, the scaling is handled by the platform. Virtualization never delivered on that promise, right? In fact, there was never a building principle of virtualization. Same thing with upgrades, right? So again, coming back to that, the differentiation, hopefully, and I think it will not be on that layer, it will be about.
But you used a very important term earlier. You talked about discipline. Now, it sounds like there's discipline in Deutsche Telekom, or you're trying to enforce that
you're
discipline.
Striving for that.
Striving for discipline. A lot of the operators we talk to don't actually have a lot of discipline because it does take that. What are the kind of challenges that you're seeing in order to sort of put that discipline in place? Any recommendations for people out there sort of struggling to go through this journey?
Just some examples. One aspect of a cloud-native operation is to adopt agile principles in the best manner. And also at DT, in a number of areas of the organization, there's a big misunderstanding. Agility and agile practices are actually the opposite of doing what you want, but rather being very, very disciplined in the way that you're doing your work. Much more so than in the classical waterfall world. But still, people think that it gives them all degrees of freedom. It gives them some autonomy in a defined space, but the way that you should be working is much more stringent than in the classical world. And adopting this, understanding this, is something that we did not do right in the first step every time. So that's one of the challenges. We're going through that learning curve. I think we are quite ahead in some areas, and we are leveraging this experience right now.
Any comments on discipline, tips and on how to
quite frankly, the discipline is a matter of changing human habits, right? And it's usually the most difficult one to get right. But I think you have to do that. Without that discipline, I think everybody will go about doing things the old way on a new technology, right? And the whole promise would essentially be the promise of delivering cost savings, agility, and all that is gone. So how an operator brings that discipline, I mean, I just joined an operator, so I really cannot comment from an operator's perspective. But I would say, it's mostly a mindset thing. The fact is, first you have to know what a blueprint would be in deploying in a cloud-native manner, and then forcing all your vendors to make sure that they adhere to that. So the moment you let a vendor take a escape route and do it in their own way, right, you break the discipline, and that results in more operational costs, more humans managing your network and all that, right? So it comes down to that, right? First knowing what to do, what is the set of rules by which every vendor needs to play, and then forcing that.
Well, I've asked all the questions so far. Are there any questions from the audience? Can't see in the...
Yeah. Hi. Mehrdad Ekbatani from Amdocs. Just interesting comment from Partha with regards to applications should not be concerned with scaling. My question or comment is that, are you assuming that the cloud is an indefinite resource with zero cost to these guys? That the application doesn't need to worry about scaling, and it can expand forever, whenever, and pay a lot of money to hyperscalers?
Yeah, well, yeah, so it's a very interesting question, right? So just to paraphrase the question, right? Should the application be worried about scaling, or should it just assume it has infinite capacity, right? Let's break it into two parts, right? The whole cloud-native philosophy is, if you just go back, let's say 10 years ago, the application building model is, if you have to scale, you have to spin up another instance of the application. You have to somehow figure out a way in which both of them will coexist together and then serve out a service, right? The new model is, meaning the application vendor does not have to figure out how that thing is stitched. As long as you adhere to certain set of principles, the scaling is provided automatically by the underlying platform. If you do it right, that's what happens, right? And several applications have essentially benefited from that model, because you don't really have to build for that anymore. So you essentially a decrease in the cost of building out these capabilities. Now coming to your other part, right? Now does that mean that you could have this an application that can just go ahead and consume a lot of resources? That's where, again, the platform comes to play, because it puts the right checks and balances, and it says that if it hits a certain threshold, it essentially stops. It's almost like the circuit breakers that we see in the stock market, right? If you have a runaway thing, it essentially would stop. So to answer your question, I think the application should assume that it can go and increase its capacity. The platform should have the right, the controls, right, to make sure that it doesn't happen. Hopefully I answered your question.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Did anybody else have a comment on that?
Yeah, maybe to add to that. I mean, that's one of the differences if I talk about pets and kettles, yeah, and also working with our dear partners, the hyperscalers, in terms of developing that. We simply cannot afford, for example, in the access, an overhead of 30%. It's not feasible from a TCO perspective. So learning that, and that's why I was saying, you also mentioned containers on bare metal, right? So we have to learn that, because we simply have to become that efficient. And I think we're an attractive target because we have large workloads, right? And that's the business model of those partners. So let's learn together how to make that work in a proper fashion. That's really it.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question from the audience, if there is one.
I've got a virtual question for you.
Virtual question.
A virtual question. Bear with me 1 minute. So one of our virtual delegates is asking, cloud native is more standardized around deployment, but how do you maintain the innovation of change that microservices offer around the constant evolving operations needs to support assurance, self-healing, and optimization in a much faster moving environment?
Again, the question is, cloud native is great as a deployment model. What do you do with lifecycle management, like service assurance, scaling, and so on? Actually, I would say cloud native is designed for more than just deployment model. I mean, obviously, it dictates a certain type of deployment model. But it also basically says, I mean, if the principles of cloud native is how do you scale an application? How does a service or rather how are faults detected and how does the service self-correct itself. So while that is great from one single application point of view, a complex network service is made up of several different such applications supplied by different vendors, right? This is where I think, as operators, as you're looking at it, I think what you have to look at is, what is the underlying platform doing in terms of service assurance across network functions that are supplied by different vendors, right? How do you detect a failure? How do you ensure that that failure is propagated to the most local service correction facility? You don't want to propagate an error all the way back to your centralized data center, because the time it takes to propagate it and then take a corrective action is too long, right? And how is the recovery of that service, the failed service, done in the fastest possible manner? That resides outside of the application. It resides outside of the cloud native paradigm, if you will, and it falls under the platform paradigm, right? That's where it happens. So to your question, cloud native from an application point of view, deployment as well as lifecycle management is handled as part of the specification itself for one app. Platforms, again, shameless plug here, like Robin.io, that's where we come in and then we provide it across these application vendors. And that's what other operators I would recommend, that you look at your platform vendor from that point of view.
Everyone agreed on that? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I think we're out of time. I've got a big time's up sign here.
Red sign.
So I'd like to thank, I think we did fulfill your brief. That was a very interesting and insightful discussion. So thank you very much to my panelists, Thomas, Bastian and Partha.